Okay, yeah, we're ready to go. So, welcome to our 7th Kurdish Tuesday. I'm Sarah Glynn. I'm co-convener of Scottish Solidarity with Kurdistan. I'm just going to set it so we've got speaker view so we don't see absolutely everybody. Oh, I think we have got it. Okay, perfect. And really pleased to welcome today Dr. Jeff Miley, who's a lecturer in sociology at Cambridge University. So we've looked in the last weeks at Rojava, at West Kurdistan, we've looked at Bashur, South Kurdistan, and now we're going to look at Bakur, North Kurdistan, the Kurdish bit of Turkey. And our first speaker at our first Kurdish Tuesday was Dila Dirik, who studied for her PhD with Jeff, and she told him about what was happening in Rojava, and he basically took up her challenge to go there. His interests, although he's an academic, his interest is much more than academic and theoretical. He's really wants to learn from Öcalan and from the Kurdish movement what can be learned for the wider struggle. And after going on the 2017 International Peace Delegation to Turkey, Jeff co-edited this book. I don't know if you can see it properly. And he co-authored a highly informative first section, it's almost half the book actually, to put the historical context of Turkish-Kurdish relations and of the Kurdish movement in Turkey and the growth of the Kurdish movement. So who better to talk about transformation of the Kurdish movement in Turkey than Jeff? So he's going to talk to us for about 40-45 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of opportunity for people to ask questions. As we've done on all these occasions, we've muted everybody. If you're not muted because you're a co-host, if you could mute just to stop it, stop any interference. Nice to see faces, because it's always nice to, when you talk, to see faces, but if you can mute, that's good. The chat's off because, well, you can communicate with me, but not with each other. I think it's quite distracting, and also it's a bit more secure not to use it. But when it comes to the questions, well, if you're on the Zoom, put your hand up or send me a message. But we'll also be checking the Facebook for questions as well. It's being live streamed on Facebook. So please share that live stream around. It's on our Scottish Solidarity with Kurdistan Facebook page. So I shall now hand over to Jeff. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited to speak in this forum. There are people who can speak better to this issue than myself, Sarah, but that's very flattering of you that you would include me amongst those who are capable of intervening in some sort of intelligent way. What I want to do is I want to present a piece, spend about 40-45 minutes talking through a piece that I wrote, an analysis that I wrote about 1.5 years ago on the heels when I had just finished the book, and trying to really think about what the situation was for the Kurdish movement, with a focus on the situation inside of Turkey, but not exclusively, and thinking about the significance of democratic confederalism from the standpoint of democratic theory as well, and try to think about it to bring some kind of contextual, historically contextualized, but also democratic theoretical reflections with respect to the transformations in the Kurdish movement. So I'll read from that text about 45 minutes, which I think should bring onto the table a whole host of issues. And then we can take it from there, have the conversation. And the text is titled Representative Democracy and the Democratic Confederal Project, Reflections on the Transformation of the Kurdish Movement in Turkey. So I begin. The legal obstacles and often harsh persecution that the Kurdish freedom movement has long faced and continues to face in Turkey are testimony to the limits to political freedom imposed by the constitutional order, which enshrines and promotes an aggressive, assimilationist, integral Turkish nationalist conception of the republic. Such a conception is incompatible with democracy in a context like that of the Republic of Turkey, a context characterized by deep diversities, associated with multiple communities of language and religious belief, a context with a long and bloody history of salient conflicts among citizens divided by alternative, competing, and resilient conceptions of group belonging and political loyalty. Nor is it a coincidence that anti-democratic forces in the Republic of Turkey have so consistently and so vehemently insisted upon, even frequently rallied around, the imperative to repress the Kurdish minority. Recourse to tyranny in the name of the Turkish national majority against a mobilized and defiant Kurdish minority has proven a most effective formula for legitimating authoritarian rule, and indeed for countering any and all emergent challenges to existing relations of hierarchy. Nationalist belligerence as the antidote to the toxic threat of solidarity among the marginalized, the exploited, the oppressed. Human rights atrocities and state terror have been and continue to be inflicted upon the Kurdish minority by Turkish security forces, most brutally in the early 90s, and now again with increasing intensity since the breakdown of peace negotiations in July of 2015. All-out war against the Kurdish freedom movement, both inside Turkey and across the border in Syria, also Iraq, has been the centerpiece of President Erdogan's alliance with the far right. Now more than ever, perhaps, the struggle for democracy in Turkey is thus intimately intertwined with the urgent need for a peaceful resolution to the so-called Kurdish question. The alternative, as we are witnessing, is spiraling violence, tyranny, and chaos. So too has the historical trajectory of the Kurdish freedom movement been profoundly influenced by the context of militarism, authoritarianism, and paramilitary violence in which and against which it initially emerged and has never ceased to be in conflict. The Republic of Turkey was on the front lines of the Cold War, a NATO member, and its security apparatus was armed to the teeth and consistently permitted, encouraged, to be ruthless in its efforts to eradicate threats to capitalist social property relations. Torture and extrajudicial killings of leftist and pro-Kurdish militants propelled a process of polarization and radicalization that took place from the late 60s, which escalated after successive coups in 1971 and 1980, coups that were intended to crush the left and that reduced the legal channels for mobilizing anti-capitalist opposition to a bare minimum. A lethal combination of legal and extra-legal repression, which together contributed to the emergence of the very kind of violent opposition whose eradication apologists for such measures claimed was the state's purpose and goal. A spiral of violence and repression was thus conjured, one that continues to this day. The Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, was born in this maelstrom. From the outset, it was structured in accordance with the Marxist-Leninist principle of democratic centralism and conceived simultaneously as a vanguard political party and as a paramilitary force, a guerrilla, committed to waging a prolonged people's war for national liberation. Its goal was the attainment of a Kurdish nation state, indeed, a state communist utopia which would unite Kurds from Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria in a greater Kurdistan. A utopian dream, no doubt, equal to, if not even exceeding in ambition, the dystopian project against which it was struggling, that of the Kemalist Republic, with its intransigent goal of assimilating, if need be annihilating, all traces of Kurdish identity into a homogenized Turkish national imaginary. The PKK acts in the name of the Kurdish nation, but as a proscribed guerrilla, it cannot be said to represent a Kurdish constituency, at least not in the same way that a legally recognized political party can. The PKK as a paramilitary guerrilla force has from the time of its inception been considered by the state authorities of the Republic of Turkey to be a terrorist organization. Indeed, Turkish authorities have consistently treated the PKK as public enemy number one, and as a result, Those suspected of belonging to the organization or even sympathizing with it have been the victims of successive waves of brutal state terror. At the height of the war between the Turkish state and the PKK in the early 90s, thousands of Kurdish villages were forcefully evacuated, tens of thousands murdered, a mass exodus provoked. More recently, since the breakdown of peace negotiations in 2015, another brutal wave of state terror has been unleashed, this time including urban settings, leaving another bloody trail of thousands killed and hundreds of thousands forcibly displaced. The PKK launched its military offensive against the Turkish state in 1984, 4 years after the 1980 coup had triggered a bout of severe state repression, 2 years after the 1982 constitutional reform had further entrenched military prerogatives, effectively confining and constricting the terrain of civilian politics. In a word, the PKK's offensive was a product and response to this context of state aggression and denial of basic civil liberties. The PKK, of course, never came close to its original goal of establishing a state communist Greater Kurdistan. And yet, it has achieved a feat that is rather remarkable nevertheless. Up against NATO's second largest army, it has managed to survive, even to thrive, to maintain a plausible claim to represent a broad constituency of Kurdish people for over 40 years now. How has this virtual stalemate with the Turkish state been possible? There is an old Kurdish saying that the Kurds have no friends but the mountains. Certainly the region's mountainous terrain has helped the guerrilla to survive, rendering it logistically difficult for the Turkish security forces to eradicate it. Even so, the many decades of survival would have been clearly impossible if the guerrilla did not count on significant levels of popular support among the Kurdish public. The racism and systemic discrimination that Kurds have long faced at the hands of the Turkish state, intertwined and combined with the poverty and exploitation that characterizes the lives of so many Kurds in both rural villages and urban shanty towns, provides an objective basis, a reservoir of material and symbolic grievances underpinning popular attitudes, helping to account for propensities to support insurrection. The systemic discrimination faced by people of Kurdish descent is not reducible to, but certainly has a lot to do with, their poverty. The grinding poverty associated with Kurdishness has not only reinforced popular prejudices against Kurds, most likely, even more importantly, it long prohibited the majority of Kurds from the opportunity to assimilate, even if they so desired. Indeed, levels of literacy in the Kurdish region have consistently been by far the highest in the country. As late as 1960, the literacy rate stood at only 15%, and as late as 1970, it remained only 30%. Significantly, it was in the 1960s that Kurdish intellectuals took advantage of the trend of liberalization that characterized that decade, both to mobilize in favor of public expression in the Kurdish language, and increasingly, over the course of the decade, to articulate the idea that the Kurdish region constitutes an internal colony. By the 1970s, Kurdish university students, including the young Abdullah Öcalan, came on the scene, committed to spreading the gospel of internal colonialism among the Kurdish masses. The so-called coup by memorandum of 1971 unleashed a crackdown on the anti-capitalist left, as well as on any and all expressions of pro-Kurdish sentiments. A crackdown that included proscriptions on political organizations accused of propagating Kurdish separatism, prosecution of prominent pro-Kurdish militants, among others, even more repressive police state tactics, including widespread torture, as security forces combed the Kurdish countryside in an effort to hunt down leftists and separatist agitators. The suppression of legal channels for expressing and mobilizing anti-capitalist dissent contributed to the proliferation of leftist guerrilla groups over the course of the 1970s, which in turn exacerbated the vehemence and the violence of the security forces, as well as that of far-right paramilitary groups with organic links to the so-called deep state. A spiral of violence had commenced, albeit one in which, it should not be forgotten, the torture and violence perpetrated and perpetuated by forces on the right far outweighed any human rights violations by forces on the left. The repressive violence will be stepped up even further after the 1980 coup. This is the context in which the PKK emerged, something all too conveniently and often ignored or forgotten in moralizing liberal condemnations of the paramilitary organization's means and ends. To insist upon the PKK's role in generating national consciousness among Kurds is not to deny pre-existing awareness, feelings, or shared senses of Kurdishness beyond the core of revolutionary militants. Instead, it is to suggest that the guerrillas' intervention transformed the significance of such sentiments, rendering Kurdish subjectivity politically salient, increasingly defiant, infused with a collective will to struggle, even if in the process it pits some Kurds against others, elevating a sanctified few to the status of heroes, while expelling others from the emergent imagined community. The sanctified few are mostly militants killed in combat, revered as martyrs, their blood sacrifice commemorated in posters as a sign of respect and as a means of strengthening resolve among the living. Their images represent and give meaning to the Kurdish struggle. The martyrs provide a model for militant ethics, a vision of revolutionary virtue. They thus exercise a powerful influence over the contours and content of political imagination in and around the Kurdish freedom movement. We shall prevail. We must prevail. The martyrs did not shed their blood in vain. Such are the sentiments evoked. This is how courage is concocted, fortitude forged. Imagined communities are also about imagined possibilities, about what people can imagine to be possible, about what they imagine themselves to be capable of enduring and achieving, about what they can imagine themselves being willing to kill for, and most importantly, what they can imagine themselves being willing to die for. When pragmatic acquiescence to an unjust status quo comes to seem unbearable, when death comes to seem preferable, when resistance comes to seem the only option, this is when new political communities are born. The martyrs, through their ultimate sacrifice, help to create new horizons of imagination among the living. In this respect, they can be said to represent the Kurdish nation, despite the fact that they are not representative. Indeed, in a way, precisely because they are not. They represent in a generative sense. Through their individual examples and deaths, they bring a new consciousness into being. They prefigure and embody the ideals of a revolutionary nation to come. There are the martyrs, and then there is the leader. The one whose appeal and authority is recognized and celebrated by virtually everybody in the movement, whose leadership is treated as indisputable, beyond question or contestation. A secular prophet, the nation in the flesh, Abdullah Öcalan. It is Öcalan for whom the martyrs fell, his vision and will that inspires the struggle. The concept of charisma most certainly applies. Max Weber proves useful for our attempt to comprehend. Weber defined charisma as, quote, a certain quality of an individual personality by virtue of which he is set apart from ordinary men and treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least specifically exceptional powers or qualities. These are such as are not accessible to the ordinary person, but are regarded as of divine origin or as exemplary. And on the basis of them, the individual concerned is treated as a leader. The followers of Öcalan are bound by his charismatic authority. They recognize in him exceptional personal qualities and extraordinary personal accomplishments, which together inspire their loyalty and obedience, very much in accordance with Weber's characterization of the phenomenon. But still, the phenomenon remains quite difficult to grasp, at least in purely secular terms. As Charles Lindholm has explained, quote, charisma as a term, of course, did not originate with Weber. It had a long history in Christian theological discourse and signified the gift of grace, resembling in some senses the Greek idea of the divine man or the Roman concept of facilitas, the hero's innate ability to project his success due to his connection with the divine. For the Christians, it meant the intuitive recognition by lay people that a saint has intimate contact with God. There is something analogous at work in the relationship between Öcalan and his disciples, which is what makes it appropriate to refer to him as a secular prophet. Among modern secular leaders, this charismatic relationship resembles in important respects the reverence long accorded to figures such as Mao and Mandela. Indeed, it was from Mao, albeit inflected through the example of Che Guevara, that Öcalan had originally devised and sought to implement the PKK's initial strategy of a prolonged people's war. And like Mao, Öcalan's tremendous popularity is linked to his recognition as a hero of the cause of national liberation. Though crucially, unlike Mao, Öcalan's movement was never victorious, though it has not been defeated either. After Mao came to power, the Chinese Communist Party would instrumentalize and transform his popular reverence, making use of the state apparatus and of authoritarian controls over political communication to carefully cultivate the image of Mao as a savior of the Chinese nation, as a means of increasing both internal cohesion and external appeal. Even so, as Lise has emphasized, this image always bore the danger of being hijacked for contradictory purposes, at least unless it remained under firm party control. And in fact, in the mid-60s, during the Cultural Revolution, Mao would consciously employ the cult to mobilize the masses against the party bureaucracy. Of course, rather than coming to power, Öcalan was forced into exile in Syria, where he lived for close to 2 decades before being forced out of that country too, eventually apprehended and subsequently imprisoned on Imrali Island, where he has remained in virtual isolation for 2 decades more. In this respect, his plight and charismatic appeal is more reminiscent to that of Nelson Mandela, whose decades-long imprisonment on Robben Island served to reinforce his moral authority, rendering him a living symbol of the oppression of his people. In the end, Mandela, like Mao, also came to power. But in contrast to Mao, he was elected into office and successfully incorporated into the liberal democratic capitalist mainstream. His charismatic appeal managed to survive, for the most part untarnished, even beyond his death, though put to the service of decidedly reformist ends. Among the pantheon of domesticated myths, right next to Gandhi and Martin Luther King, Öcalan instead remains to this day a captive, confined to a lonely existence in conditions of extreme isolation inside his prison cell, chained to the rock of Imrali. Though in a way he has been fortunate, for his captivity has allowed him thus far to avoid succumbing to either of the twin temptations of tyranny or co-optation. Charismatic leadership stands in considerable tension to the logic of representative democracy. As a type of authority, Weber contrasted it explicitly to traditional modes of rule on the one hand and to legal rational ones on the other. Weber conceived of charismatic authority as both a revolutionary and an unstable form of authority. One of the distinguishing features of charismatic leaders, according to Ivan Zeleny, a prominent interpreter of Weber, is their ability to promise change and to radically alter people's attitudes and values. This is both the source of charisma's strength as well as of its instability, since it tends to deteriorate if the leader cannot produce the promised changes. In the process, charismatic relationships are routinized, channeled, and transformed into one of the other two modes of rule. The radical alterations in people's attitudes and values that charismatic leaders are capable of inducing renders them revolutionary. And yet, the difficulty of delivering on their promises renders their charismatic authority unstable, prone to dissipation, routinization, or both. Öcalan's imprisonment, like that of Mandela, has resulted in a strengthening of his charismatic appeal, an intensification of devotion to him among his followers. But at the same time, his prolonged isolation has also induced a good dose of self-reflection about the dangers of the twin temptations of tyranny and co-optation. In fact, well before his arrest from 1993, at the height of the war, in the midst of devastating human rights atrocities by the Turkish security forces, including mass village evacuations, Öcalan had begun to make calls for peace. Such calls were due in no small part to a pragmatic recognition of the impossibility of ever winning a prolonged people's war against NATO's second largest army, especially given the global balance of power in the post-Cold War world. But the end of the Cold War also got Öcalan thinking about the reasons for the defeat of state communism. So began a long process of reassessment, rearticulation, and transformation of both the means and the ends of the movement he had inspired, a process that would accelerate in the months and years after his arrest. Paradoxically enough, prison turned out to be a place of mental freedom for Öcalan, who, despite very limited access to books, has produced a most impressive corpus of writings, both in terms of volume and ambition. In one of his most recent publications, Öcalan has reflected explicitly on this paradoxically emancipatory impact of imprisonment on the parameters of his thought. In his words, quote, "Before prison, While I was able to develop in theory and practical action, I did not have much of a chance to develop the perception of truth. For those who have grave problems, the circumstances of a prison are of educational significance. Thus, though prisons are not areas of theoretical and practical struggle, but instead are areas where those who are not crushed by such problems may develop a successful perception of truth and necessary mode of struggle for it. Prisons allow those who fight for exceptional causes to work hard each day to attain the truth. Prison time that is spent on the acquisition of truth is, I am certain, worthwhile. From seeker of power to seeker of truth. Such are the terms Öcalan chooses to depict the transition of his existential orientation while in captivity. His will to power kept in check, and a lot of time on his hands to read, to think, to write. A monastic life of sorts, which would appear to have opened epistemic horizons previously denied him. Though unlike a monk or an ordinary prisoner, millions hang on his every word. While in prison, Öcalan has used his charismatic authority to effect a paradigm shift in the Kurdish freedom movement, from a Marxist-Leninist conception of national liberation to a radical democratic critique of the state, and of patriarchy as the root of all hierarchy. Indeed, influenced by the work of the libertarian municipalist and social ecologist Murray Bookchin, Öcalan has elaborated a thoroughgoing critique of the tenets of democratic centralism, alongside a principled renunciation of the goal of a Kurdish nation state. A democratic confederal alternative, not just for Kurds, but for the broader Middle East. Quite an unexpected, radical democratic turn coming from a charismatic guerrilla leader of a national liberation movement. Unprecedented even, perhaps. An attempt to channel his charismatic appeal and influence not towards the conquest of state power, but rather to get his followers to embrace a comprehensive critique of all relations of hierarchy, oppression, and domination. An exercise in democratic leadership, one is tempted to conclude. The theory of democracy has a hard time dealing with leadership. Indeed, to many, the very notion of democratic leadership will probably sound like a contradiction in terms, if not a cynical catchphrase, like that of democratic centralism. The Leninist conception of democratic centralism served to legitimate a monopoly of power by the Communist Party. In turn, a monopoly of power within the party by the Central Committee. In turn, most often, a monopoly of power within the Central Committee by the party chairman. In a word, autocracy, or dictatorship, couched in the language of democracy. All leadership, no democracy, if not in theory, certainly in the practice of democratic centralism. In this vein, from his jail cell, Öcalan has expressed some rather piercing self-critical thoughts, at the same time implicitly directed at the operational commanders of the guerrilla organization he created and continues to inspire and even nominally to lead. In Öcalan's words, quote, "The PKK had been conceived as a party with a state-like hierarchical structure similar to other parties. Such a structure, however, causes a dialectic contradiction to the principles of democracy, freedom, and equality, a contradiction in principle concerning all parties whatsoever their philosophy. Although the PKK stood for freedom-oriented views, we had not been able to free ourselves from thinking in hierarchical structures." The guerrilla has not been disarmed or disbanded, a development which Öcalan has never advocated or foreseen, even at the height of the peace process, his calls for the organization to lay down its arms notwithstanding. This is the crux of the issue from the standpoint of the Turkish state, or for that matter, from the standpoint of any state. But what is more problematic, at least from the standpoint of a commitment to radical democracy, nor has the organization's hierarchical structure, its chain of command, been transformed, despite Öcalan's emphasis and efforts to encourage a paradigm shift. The Kurdish freedom movement, however, encompasses more than the PKK. Indeed, as Akaya and Jungerdun have insisted, from 2005, the PKK and all affiliated organizations were restructured along the lines of the democratic confederal model under the name of the Union of Kurdistan Communities, and organized alongside the Democratic Society Congress, conceived as part of the attempt to forge a new political paradigm, defined by the direct and continual exercise of the people's power through village, town, and city councils. How has this transition from Marxist-Leninist democratic centralist guerrilla party into a more decentralized, more horizontally networked movement taken place? What have been the main achievements, challenges, and obstacles for this reorganization and reorientation, this paradigm shift? And what have been the consequences of this process of transformation for the movement? These are very important questions about which the literature on the Kurdish movement, in English at least, remains equivocal when not entirely silent. The equivocations, the awkward silences of the literature are symptomatic of the taboos, contradictions, and limits of human rights normative discourse exacerbated in the age of the War on Terror. The devastation and trauma wrought upon the Kurdish people by the Turkish security forces, the systematic state terror, the total evacuation of thousands of villages, the killing of tens of thousands, the displacement and exile of millions, made it abundantly clear to Öcalan by the early 90s that the Maoist cum Guevarista strategy of a prolonged people's war by the PKK could not lead to military victory, to national liberation, to the creation of an independent socialist Kurdish nation state. The military might of NATO's second biggest army, exercised within its own sovereign territory, was simply too brutal, too overwhelming a force to overcome. Faced with the realization of the impossibility of victory, even the prospect of total annihilation, Öcalan began to reach out to European politicians, from his refuge in the Bekaa Valley and in Damascus, in search of a way to end the war without sacrificing the dignity of the Kurdish people, in search of a way towards a peaceful and democratic resolution to the raging conflict. The end of the Cold War undoubtedly also influenced Öcalan's burgeoning conviction that the party and the movement which he had brought into being was in dire need of reformation, indeed of fundamental reorientation. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant the disappearance of a state communist bloc capable of patronizing and protecting a liberated single-party socialist Kurdish republic, inevitably wedged between hostile neighboring nation states. It simultaneously signified the death knell of the credibility of the state communist ideal. In sum, it induced a crisis both at the level of realpolitik and at the level of principles. These were also developments originating from the there were also developments originating from the grassroots in Bakur, which were amplified, encouraged, and promoted by the organized diaspora in Europe, operating within the orbit of the movement. These developments included the spread of public celebrations and mass protests, most emblematically around the annual Nowruz festival, reconstrued as a myth of Kurdish resistance, as well as in events organized to commemorate the self-immolation of PKK prisoners and other heroic acts of sacrifice among PKK martyrs. Indeed, a whole repertoire of representation of resistance practices emerged, congealing around the myth of Nowruz and also hoisting up a host of exemplars, a veritable pantheon of revolutionary martyrs, the public commemoration, even worship of whom burst onto the streets in a wave of so-called serhildam, or rebellions. From the early 90s, such burgeoning civil resistance against the security forces came increasingly to complement the ongoing guerrilla campaign. One of the more remarkable aspects of the repertoire of representation of Kurdish resistance that emerged from the early 90s onwards was the prominent place of women. Not only did women participate in large numbers in the numerous serhildam, they also took an active role in the activities of the legal political Kurdish parties. Indeed, they came to the forefront of the resistance and were increasingly constituted and commemorated as exemplars. Alongside and helping to propel such emergent symbolic and organizational prominence of women in the movement, over the course of the 90s, Öcalan would formulate an elaborate theoretical critique of patriarchy. Indeed, he would come to consider women as the first colony, and even to redefine national liberation as first and foremost the liberation of women. Öcalan's emphasis on the primacy of struggle against patriarchy was quite developed even before his abduction and imprisonment, and is featured prominently in his copious prison writings, perhaps especially in his original synthesis and articulation of the long history of hierarchy, his vision of the dialectic of domination and resistance. In Öcalan's account of patriarchy, its origins are intimately intertwined with the emergence of the state, and especially since his imprisonment, Öcalan's thought has taken a radically anti-statist turn. What began as a pragmatic, realistic appraisal of the impossibility of attaining a Kurdish nation state through a guerrilla war against Turkish security forces, and as a compromise proposal calling for respect for human rights and cultural rights, alongside measures of decentralization or autonomy, developed, under the influence perhaps especially of Murray Bookchin, into a principled rejection of the state. In effect, Öcalan advanced a redefinition of self-determination, now understood as radical direct democracy against the state. Under Bookchin's influence, Öcalan would also take up the theme of the urgent need for social ecology. Even so, as with the emphasis on the struggle against patriarchy, the sensitivity of the movement to ecological issues was not just born like Athena. It did not just spring spontaneously out of Öcalan's head. Instead, it was forged in concrete struggles, most emblematically the struggle to save the ancient village of Hasinkiev in the province of Batman, set to be submerged underwater by the Turkish state's Ilisu Dam project. A struggle in which the European environmentalist movement would forge organic links with the Kurdish movement, thereby prefiguring the overlapping, decentralized networks of resistance envisioned by the democratic confederal ideal. Öcalan's articulation of democratic confederalism grows out of a deepest disenchantment with and critique of Marxism-Leninism, which, in quasi-confessional terms, in a series of penetrating self-criticisms of his own previous mentality, he accuses of reproducing the cult of hierarchy, of behaving as organizations like mini-states, acting in accordance with the logic of conquest and domination rather than resistance and freedom. The emphasis on the struggle against patriarchy, the fostering of awareness of the urgency of social ecology, the thoroughgoing critique of the state, the promotion of popular assemblies, and championing of radically decentralized direct democracy, all of these components of the paradigm shift are explicitly contrasted to the democratic centralist model and mindset. Likewise, Öcalan's critique of Marxism-Leninism includes a critique of its scientism, of its hostility to the realm of myth, of its bias in favor of secular fundamentalism. In this latter vein, in recent years, Öcalan has urged the Kurdish movement to organize a democratic Islam Congress with the purpose of elaborating a liberationist interpretation of the ethical and political implications of professing and practicing authentic Islamic faith. Whether in practice the tradition and perception of militant secularism among movement cadres and supporters has been transformed is another matter, certainly worthy of close empirical investigation, given not only the history of conflict with Kurdish Hezbollah, to which several texts have referred, but also in terms of countering the appeal of Erdogan's AKP and its brand of patriarchal neoliberal Islam, not to mention the struggle against reactionary jihadists in Rojava. The fact that the first Kurdish rebellions against the Kemalist Republic were mobilized along the secular religious divide in the name of the community of believers is not irrelevant in this respect in the present. Indeed, the proper relation between religion and politics continues to be a source of dispute and contestation capable of dividing contemporary Kurds. The movement's attempt to articulate a democratic Islam is intended to transcend such divisions. How serious and successful this attempt is will no doubt condition the contours and horizons of support for the ambitious democratic and federal project advanced by the Kurdish freedom movement. Finally, and crucially, the principled rejection of the strategy of national liberation, understood in terms of the pursuit of a Kurdish nation state, has included a rather elaborate set of arguments against the insidious evils of what Öcalan refers to as feudal nationalism, most often in reference to the example of Barzani in South Kurdistan. The ideological and programmatic reorientation of the Kurdish freedom movement thus includes not just a renunciation of the goal of a state, but more ambitiously the aspiration to transcend altogether the confines of the nationalist imaginary, a transcendence which should not be confused with repudiating pride and Kurdishness, but rather with escaping the dialectic of majority versus minority. Indeed, as Öcalan has insisted, in democratic confederalism, quote, there is no room for any kind of hegemony striving. Self-administration and autonomous organization of direct assemblies, not to mention of self-defense militias for all ethnic and religious groups as the alternative to the tyranny of the majority, to the hegemonic striving deeply ingrained in the ideology of nationalism. A tall order to ask from a movement that has sacrificed so many lives for the dream of a greater Kurdistan. An exercise of democratic leadership, if ever there was, on the part of Öcalan, his attempt to get his followers to dream internationalist dreams of radical democracy, to imagine forms of confederation that cut across and beyond the mental borders imposed by the cult of national community, easier to pronounce than to achieve. the struggle against patriarchy, the struggle for social ecology, the struggle against the nation state, the struggle against sectarianism in all its forms, the struggle for radical direct democracy. These are all significant departures from the original articulation of the struggle for national liberation, understood as the creation of a state communist Greater Kurdistan. Indeed, ambitious aspirations and a thoroughgoing reorientation of the goals of the movement, which mainstream social scientists interested in understanding the movement too often either ignore or downplay, and which advocates for the movement tend to take or at least portray at face value. The organizational transformations undertaken since 2005 have been conceived and justified as means to decentralize and thus democratize, indeed de-Leninize, the Kurdish freedom movement. But it would be a mistake to think that Öcalan's intention has been to unambiguously compromise or moderate the radicalism, indeed the profound anti-capitalism of the movement. To the contrary, if anything, the project of democratic confederalism, articulated as radical direct democracy against the state, provides a more fundamental, more thoroughgoing critique and threat to the status quo assumptions of the international order in the age of globalized plutocracy and the Orwellian war on terror, especially if the appeal of the program were to spread beyond the project's Kurdish constituency. If it were to be embraced en masse by Turks, by Arabs, by Persians, and beyond. The articulation and practice of self-determination as direct democracy, as collective action in accordance with the principles of social ecology, would indeed constitute a major threat for all the geopolitical alliances and local power blocks vying for influence and control across a bleeding region and globe. By contrast, the emergence of another independent crony capitalist or even state communist come state capitalist petro-state would ultimately constitute a much less threatening prospect for the global system. Though, of course, the discourse of democracy, even the discourse of radical direct democracy, is sufficiently rife with ambiguity, aporia, even contradictions to be simultaneously susceptible to opportunist as well as insurrectionist interpretations, intentions, and derivations. The paradoxes of power and politics cannot be abolished by organizational fiat, programmatic pronouncement, or ideological catchphrases alone. It is one thing to declare radical decentralization and horizontal participatory organizational forms, another altogether to actually operate in accordance with such principles. An egalitarian and participatory ethos capable of promoting both a deep respect for freedom and a will to struggle for collective justice to the point of ultimate sacrifice is indeed hard to come by, even harder perhaps to create. The problems associated with vanguardism are difficult to avoid, even in the absence of explicit hierarchical organizational forms. Informal tyranny and effective concentration of power can occur without formal hierarchy. In fact, in some ways, and in some circumstances, structurelessness, or formally horizontal structures, may be even more conducive to tyranny and or easier for a minority faction to control than organizations structured in accordance with more bureaucratized, formalized hierarchies. The specter of tyranny cannot be so easily vanquished. It is inherent in the realm to the realm of politics. As Rosa Luxemburg rightly stressed in her own incisive prophetic polemic against Bolshevism, dating back to 1904, organizational form itself ultimately reveals more about circumstances than it does about principles. Particular historical trajectories and dynamics, concrete political contexts tend to impose specific organizational forms. Moreover, most crucially, so long as only a minority of the population is mobilized and actively participating, regardless of formal organizational structure, the reality of vanguardism will remain. Decisions affecting broad constituencies and programmatic pronouncements made in their name will in fact be made by small minorities. The democratic and federal reorientation of the Kurdish movement has facilitated a flourishing of pro-Kurdish electoral party politics. Admittedly, there is a deeper history to pro-Kurdish party politics in the Turkish electoral arena, with precedents of victories of pro-Kurdish candidates in municipal elections in Batman and Diyarbakir dating back to 1977, though one of these candidates would be murdered, the other imprisoned. Even so, from the early 90s, coinciding with the outbreak of the Serhildan, the mass street rebellions, the burgeoning civil resistance that came to complement the ongoing guerrilla campaign, pro-Kurdish representation was able to return as the movement managed to build an institutional base and endure the state's numerous attempts to suppress it, with a series of political parties emerging, then being suppressed, then emerging anew to challenge the established order in Turkey, to recognize Kurdish identity and cultural rights, and putting forward proposals for political reconciliation to end the cycle of violence. In the wake of the paradigm shift, initially against a backdrop of relative liberalization and efforts to converge with European norms, the advances of the movement in electoral politics at both the municipal and parliamentary levels have been considerable. The prospects for peace, especially in the period between 2013 and 2015, contributed to unprecedented levels of electoral support for the pro-Kurdish HDP. In July of 2015, against a backdrop of escalating tensions, intimidation, and harassment, the party nevertheless managed to pass the very high 10% threshold to form for the first time a parliamentary group in the Grand National Assembly, and did so again in the snap election in the fall, amidst the wave of state repression that was unleashed after the breakdown of the peace process. Kurdish people are divided across 4 states. Their plight the incarnation of the contradictions of dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of the nation-state form in the so-called Middle East at the end of the First World War. The Kurdish freedom movement may have given up on the goal of an independent nation-state encompassing the whole of Greater Kurdistan, but it has not surrendered its commitment to some form of political unity among all Kurds. Indeed, the project of democratic confederalism explicitly institutionalizes forms of confederal collaboration within a transnational Middle Eastern union. To this degree, the movement has never ceased to object to the institutional legacies left by Sykes-Picot or Lausanne, even if Öcalan has been emphatic that his paradigm shift envisions transcending state borders, not creating new ones. The establishment of a stronghold in the north of Syria by the Kurdish freedom movement against the backdrop of civil war and state collapse, the emergence and consolidation of a revolutionary space for constructing democratic confederalism in practice, has had tremendous ramifications for political dynamics inside of Turkey. The heroic resistance of the Kurdish forces in Kobane was instrumental in setting off alarms within the Turkish state security apparatus. Moreover, the Turkish state's selective enforcement of its southern border, its complicity with the crossing of international jihadis, contrasted with the vigor and lethal force which it proved willing to exercise in order to prohibit Kurds from Bakur from crossing to help defend Kobane, only served to douse fuel on a simmering fire, especially after Erdogan appeared on television to gloat about an imminent fall of the city. The window of opportunity, the prospects for peace, were thus undermined by developments beyond the Turkish borders, a spillover of the conflict in Syria, which ultimately precipitated and unleashed the ongoing all-out war on the Kurdish freedom movement, now operative on both sides of the border and in Iraqi Kurdistan as well. Amidst the polarizing dynamics of violent state repression and street mobilization across the Kurdish region of Turkey, in the broader context of the siege of Kobane, latent ambivalences and ambiguities in terms of tactics and strategies associated with the democratic confederal model were thrust to the surface. The detonator being the decision by some urban youth associated with the movement to dig trenches, to attempt to block the access of Turkish security forces from passing into certain neighborhoods. A de facto declaration of democratic autonomy intended as a display of collective self-defense, explicitly justified in terms of Öcalan's principles and goals as an effort to construct democratic confederalism. Some months later, after the PKK had called off its ceasefire in summer, dozens of pro-Kurdish municipal authorities would in turn issue declarations of democratic autonomy. First the trenches, then the full-fledged declarations of local autonomy. These actions were interpreted by Turkish security forces as nothing short of treasonous assaults on state sovereignty, and so triggered a swift escalation in the intensity and extent of state repression, including the imprisonment of thousands of political representatives and movement activists, HDP co-chairs and MPs, and BDP mayors, city councilors among them, as well as the siege of close to 60 municipalities, a veritable human rights atrocity. Which brings us back to Lenin. The fact is, the democratic confederal model, at least as articulated by Öcalan and his followers, may reject the Leninist principle of democratic centralism, and may even reject the Leninist conception of national liberation. But it does not abandon the Leninist analysis of the situation of dual power, nor does it renounce a willingness to engage in armed insurrection. Indeed, its vision is one of armed militias organized for the purpose of people's self-defense, a vision of democracy against the state. And so in Turkey and in Syria, the Kurdish freedom movement finds itself at the crossroads, in a critical juncture for the future of the democratic and federal ideal, one predicted by none other than Murray Bookchin, with whose prophetic words we shall conclude. Quote, "Libertarian municipalists do not delude themselves that the state will view with equanimity their attempts to replace professionalized power with popular power. They harbor no illusions that the ruling classes will indifferently allow a communalist movement to demand rights that infringe on the state's sovereignty over towns and cities. Historically, regions, localities, and above all towns and cities have desperately struggled to reclaim their local sovereignty from the state, albeit not always for high-minded purposes. Communalist attempts to restore the power of towns and cities and to knit them together into confederations can be expected to invoke increasing resistance from national institutions. That the new popular assemblyist municipal confederations will embody a dual power against the state that becomes a source of growing political tension is obvious. Either a communalist movement will be radicalized by this tension and will resolutely face all its consequences, or it will surely sink into a morass of compromises that absorb it back into the social order that it once sought to change. How the movement meets this challenge is a clear measure of its seriousness in seeking to change the existing political system and the social consciousness it develops as a source of public education and leadership." With that, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Goodness, what a sweep of history we've just gone through. I don't know if is anybody communicating with me for any questions, or I mean, I can always ask some. Well, since we haven't heard from anybody else, I was wondering, I mean, you were saying earlier on that Öcalan was recognizing that it was an unwinnable war in a way. So was those declarations of autonomy in 2015, were they also, do you feel, destined to fail?
That's a very controversial subject within the Kurdish movement itself. I was part of peace delegations that went into Turkey after the breakdown after the breakdown of the peace process, which is what came into the book. No, and at the time we talked to many of the Kurdish representatives, people who've been involved in the negotiations with the state, and some of them were even saying that at the time Öcalan was relaying to the movement that he thought that the trenches were a terrible mistake, and that the trenches had to be stopped. However, I went back on another delegation, the same Imrali delegation, the following year, and the people in the movement were telling a very different story, in which they were saying that that there was a state policy that was based on implementing a Sri Lankan model of extermination, and that had there not been trenches, that the bloodshed would have been even worse. Was what some of this, in fact, some of this very same people told very different stories the two times we were there. One which was much closer to when the event happened, in which the story was a story of Öcalan being opposed to the trenches and trying to stop the trench warfare, and trying to get the Kurdish youth to listen that this was suicidal. And then later there was a story about how the Turkish state apparatus was convinced that what it had to go for a policy and a project of annihilation and that the self-defense was necessary against this brutal genocidal the brutal genocidal machinations. My sense is that inside and around the Kurdish movement, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the question of the tactic of the trench warfare. And it ultimately speaks to the issue of the disjuncture and the analogy between the situation in Rojava in the north of Syria and in Turkey, where the radical discrepancy in the situation, because in Rojava, the movement manages to take control and effectively revolutionize society in the context where there's a state collapse, there's a civil war, the state collapses, and in fact the state retreats. Whereas in Turkey you have NATO's second biggest army, massive tyrannical militarized state apparatus very much in place. And so one can say that the implementation of insurrectionist tactics in urban settings in particular in those situations are much more dangerous. But like I say, this speaks to a really, I think, controversial subject in and around the movement itself, because obviously there's so many lives that were lost, and people in the movement don't want to be seen as blaming the victim, so to speak. But it's a crucial question of tactic. That's why I ended on that question. And it is, I think, ultimately it's not just a question that confronts democratic confederalism in Turkey, but it's a question that confronts those of us who are interested in a radical democratic alternative to the nation state, that ultimately you come up against the monopoly of violence of the state. So that's what Bookchin was himself referring to as the dilemma of the libertarian municipalist agenda. I don't know if that.
I don't think Bookchin ever tells us how to get from where we are now to where we want to be with this.
No, maybe Janet has some. Janet was here earlier. Maybe she has something to say about Bookchin on that. But yeah.
We've got a question from Azad. I'll unmute you, Azad. Oh, don't seem to have. You there? Oh. You keep muting yourself.
Sorry. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm from Rojava, and I did my PhD on similar subject on the Turkish official discourse of terrorism that has been used against the PKK and other Kurdish movements, including the PYD and YPG in Rojava. I believe that the designation of the PKK by the NATO governments is based on no appropriate legal criteria, but on their willingness to appease the NATO member Turkey. My question is related to this. Is it possible or plausible that the Kurds and the Friends in Scotland, UK, and wider Europe launch campaigns for delisting the PKK and making awareness regarding the flagrant crimes perpetrated by the Turkish authorities under the banner of fighting against terrorism or counterterrorism? How much such campaign might bring about positive outcomes? Why I'm asking this question, it's quite important, I think, not only for the struggle of the PKK as a political party, but the entire Kurdish nation. Why I'm saying this, I believe that while the designation of the PKK by the NATO government is like a cruel change that not only hampers the Kurdish struggle for national and democratic rights, but also it hampers the attempts of making awareness regarding the flagrant crimes that have been perpetrated by the Turkish authorities against the Kurds, either in the occupied northern Kurdistan or in Rojava or southern Kurdistan. This level has been abused by the Turkish system, similarly to the way the apartheid, used the terrorist label not only to delegitimize the struggle of African National Congress and African nation and their democratic right, but also for the subjugation of Africans. The designation of the PKK has been used to subjugate the Kurdish nation and perpetrate ethnic cleansing operations against the Kurds, not only in Turkey, as you can see in Rojava, what's happening in Afrin. Turkey colonial system is similar to the apartheid and has been built on racism and subjugation of non-Sunni Turks. Here it's relevant to remember the genocide perpetrated by the Turkish colonial system against Armenians, Greeks, Christians, Alawis, Yazidis, Yazidi Kurds, and denying, I'm not denying that even Sunni Turks are victims of the Turkish repressive system themselves. So I believe that designation is a key, delisting the PKK is a key to unlock the change on the Kurdish struggle. It's key to unlock the change on making proper awareness regarding the subjugation of the Kurdish nation and the Turkish crimes against the Kurdish nation. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I certainly very much agree that the designation of the PKK as a terrorist organization as at the very heart, at the center of the attempt to criminalize the Kurdish resistance and the Kurdish movement and the Kurdish people ultimately. I think that the part of the struggle of the Kurdish movement in alliance and solidarity with the broader left in the diaspora has been to challenge this question. And there have been cases that have been brought before European courts. And very recently in Belgium, there was the case where the verdict was that in fact this designation is not correct. That we should think of them as combatants in a war situation, and that what there is and so there is certainly legal efforts to get through the courts to challenge this sort of thing. However, and those efforts have in recent years. Jan Fairman is someone who's pushed those efforts and had some successes. I think Estella is here. She could talk about the specifics of that, which is very important precedents of court decisions, some recent court decisions going along those lines. However, you're up against a very strong apparatus, which is a war on terror apparatus, which is internationalized and part of NATO, and be given Turkey's strategic significance within NATO and more generally amongst different geopolitical actors that may even be at odds with NATO. So think Russia, even China, that the desire to be on good terms with Turkey is something in Turkey, the Turkish state frames as its #1 existential question is something that is at the order of the day. And my sense is that the war on terror, it's a lot easier to get on that list than it is to get off of it. And the idea, and this is one of the difficulties that you find with respect to the dynamics of the Kurdish resistance, is if you end up playing like we don't belong on that list, but some other people do belong on that list, you end up playing the good terrorist versus bad terrorist. You're in a dynamic, and the Kurds have been pulled into that dynamic, which is ultimately linked to this broader Orwellian war on terror, which produces the effects that it claims to be fighting against. So I think that I think it's important to very much support the efforts to decriminalize the PKK, but those efforts to decriminalize the PKK have to be embedded within a broader critical perspective about what the function and purpose of the war on terror, which is internationalized and affects a whole host of communities which are effectively criminalized through this war on terror apparatus. So that would be my way of not answering entirely your concern, but definitely speaking to them.
Thanks very much. And we did actually have Jan Furman speaking on these issues on our third Kurdish Tuesday.
Okay, good.
So if you scroll down on our Facebook page, you should be able to find the link to that. I've got a couple of other people wanting to ask questions. So if we go Hanifi first and then Paul afterwards. So Hanifi, I'll unmute you. Oh, I've lost you. Someone else unmuted you.
Hanifi's there.
Yeah, has he been unmuted?
He's not unmuted, no.
Oh, there he is. There we are.
So patient too with your hand was raised.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeff, for the fascinating presentation. So, being from Turkey, from the Kurdistan of Turkey, of course, I went through the whole historical process again. It's
traumatic.
Yeah, traumatic. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Thank you. So regarding the war of so-called war of trenches, in 2015 and 16, generally people will speak about it as a phenomenon of 2015, but lately I think it was 2016. When Imrali notes, so-called Imrali notes, or the registry of negotiations between Öcalan and the government were made public, I was able to read from the notes that the whole, actually the whole negotiations starting from November 2013 between the prime minister of the time or his delegates and between Öcalan was about Rojava. And to just put it short, the Turkish government asked Öcalan to give up the administration in Rojava and connect their forces in Rojava with the Turkish proxy forces to fight against the regime. This starts in November 2013, very early, just before the trenches. And actually we know that although the trenches were there for about 2 years, and although it was known that certain groups were armed in Kurdish cities in Turkey, the government turned a blind eye because there was a peace process going on one hand, and the negotiations between Öcalan and the government was also going on. So the thing I got from the Imrali notes was that they didn't agree on the situation in Rojava, and Öcalan made it clear that they are not going to give up Rojava to the proxy forces of Turkey, or that the Kurdish forces in Rojava wouldn't be fighting against the Assad regime as a proxy force for the Turkish army or for the Turkish government. So the main disagreement between Öcalan and the Turkish state was that, and since they didn't agree on that point alone, then Öcalan or the Kurdish movement brought the war to Turkey. That was their only cause, of course. So if you do not allow us to keep our administration in Rojava, then we will bring the war to you in Turkey. And that's what I think the main disagreement and the main reason that the peace process didn't conclude in a desirable way. So I wonder if you have managed to read the Imrali notes, or if you have heard this or read about this from any source.
I've heard about the Imrali notes. I haven't read them myself, but one of my close collaborators, one of the co-authors of the chapter in the book, Historical Context, he's told me quite a bit about those notes, and certainly it's your interpretation of those notes seems plausible, and it's like I say, there's multiple interpretations. Some interpretations which, as you say, focus on this question of the trenches, but ultimately, and the way that I frame it, I think, in the paper, is that the crucial question has to do with the developments in Rojava, and the escalation of the situation in Rojava kind of effectively spills over and undermines the peace process, the prospects for peace inside of Turkey. So I think that I don't think it's ultimately a question of either or. I think there are multiple factors in a contingent process, and then we could read post facto, oh, it was bound to be one way or the other. But I do think that that's certainly the situation of the stronghold in the north of Syria and the way that played itself out, in particular after the heroic defense of Kobane, and the way in which the Kurdish movement became a key player in the whole conflict in Syria and remains so to this day, is something that absolutely terrified the Turkish state apparatus, and I think in some respects over-determines the internal developments inside of Turkey. So I would agree with your interpretation in that respect as well. But I don't think that means that therefore the question of the tactics inside of Turkey is not a question that can or even should be debated within the movement and amongst people supporting of the movement, thinking about how we effectively resist. So I think that debate is still a relevant debate, but it needs to be contextualized within the broader. There's a way in which, like, focusing on, we're going to talk about the situation in Syria today, then we're going to talk about the situation in Turkey tomorrow, the situation in Iraq the next day, the situation in Iran the next day, that's not sufficient. And we have to think about the way in which the Kurdish question overlaps and is a regional and even global question. Because when we think about the previous question with respect to what is at stake with respect to the designation of the PKK as a terrorist organization, well, ultimately we have to talk about the whole dynamics of NATO and what NATO's up to in the struggle for power around the world. So so we have to be thinking about multiple scales of our analysis of determination, so to speak. But anyhow, yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a very important information you bring to the table.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to go to Paul now, if I can find you. And then Stephen after that. Yeah. Should be able to, oh, you keep muting yourself when I've unmuted you? How does that work?
Okay, all right, great. I think we're set. Okay, so short comment followed by a question. Thank you so much, Professor Miley, for your great talk. Gelek spas Azad, Gelek spas Hanifi for your comments as well, particularly the Imrali notes, which are absolutely crucial to an understanding of the dynamics which have occurred. And unfortunately, this is an aspect that the media really hasn't played on, but which is crucially important to understand the completely different world vision about what the Democratic Confederalists in Syria wanted to achieve versus Erdogan's sinister plan, which became clearer and clearer as time went on, that it was less about Assad or anti-Assad and more about destroying the the cohesion of Kurdish voices, of women voices, of democratic and federal voices. So again, Hanifi, thank you much for sharing that. My question relates to the United States and the SDF and the Democratic Confederalist Forces in Rojava.
Yeah.
Dr. Miley, in your interview, A Middle East Beyond Oppressive Nation States and Imperialism is Possible, you described the ups and downs of cooperation between the SDF and the US military. And clearly for the SDF, you know, post the genocide in Sinjar and during the time of Kobani, it was absolutely an issue of survival. They didn't really have a choice. But if we look at the trajectory on the United States government side, where you had, you know, Obama and Biden breaking with the jihadists, you know, changing their policy, shifting their limited support toward the SDF, you know, toward the Rojava project, at least militarily, and then Trump's betrayal later on, placate Erdogan. And in the likely event that Trump loses the election and there's a new US administration, what do you believe are going to be the likely choices that Rojava authorities will face given a new potential posture of a Biden government?
You know, it's a really good question. I know that within the American military establishment and in the foreign policy establishment more generally, there was a lot of dismay around Trump's decision. In fact, it seemed that CENTCOM was trying to push back as much as it could. For as long as it possibly could, CENTCOM was arguing in favor of the crucial significance of the tactical alliance with the SDF. And my read of it was that it was a deal between Trump and Erdogan that in some respects overrode what Central Command's desire. So my sense is that, but the thing is now things have been, the situation has transformed and things have been consummated. So it's not clear what CENTCOM wants to do going forward. And I haven't followed it closely enough with respect to like what the Biden campaign is saying. The Biden campaign, I mean, in the context of the COVID crisis, has been very silent, and in general, the politics surrounding the election have had very little to say about this question. Even though, and I just haven't. I wrote an article with my student Guna Yildiz on the situation leading up to right at the moment when the Trump administration betrayed the SDF, and trying to think through that. But since then, I haven't been following it closely enough to know to be able to answer your question. But I think it's a crucial question, and it then furthermore, you know, poses the question like, what is the coherence of American foreign policy in the Middle East at all? Is there a coherent American foreign policy in the Middle East? So when we think, we tend on the left have a story, which is a story about imperial designs for the region, thinking about control of resources, etc. But it seems that there's a lot of chaos and incoherence when it comes to the decision-making process. Certainly under the Trump administration, it's not clear what's going to happen. As I agree with you, the likely event that the Biden administration comes into power. Although it's not even. There's so much that's unclear with respect to the situation in the United States. Trump recently has been even suggesting that he might not acknowledge defeat. So the level of unraveling of the American system is something that injects a lot of irrationality into the whole situation. So very good question. I wish that I could be more informative in my response, except for to say that I think that that's an important terrain to look at, to keep on the radar and to put on the radar.
It's almost like Biden thinks that the less he says, the more people might vote for him sometimes, I think. I'm going to
I mean, the information has to be out there. There has to be, I mean, you could look it up. You could try to do some research to see what are his foreign policy advisors saying with respect to the situation and CENTCOM and what's going on with CENTCOM. How has CENTCOM responded? Because even the situation with respect to like how much there remains tacit collaboration between the SDF and the American military presence, which remains present in the region, is something that has gone completely under the radar. And so it's like with COVID, with everything that's going on, people aren't paying attention to what's happening there. But I agree with Paul that it is nevertheless a very crucial question. Maybe you have your own thoughts on the matter, Paul?
Do I have to, maybe have to
Unmute him. Yeah, I'd like to hear what he has to say because he sounds informed on the issue.
Thank you for the second chance at life here. So actually, for example, the Emergency Committee for Java has been thinking a lot about this question and about potentially, you know, striving to have a say in terms of you know, are there channels open and how that might move forward. And again, I think that many of us, you know, on the left, outside of the Middle East, you know, as much as the nation state in and of itself from a democratic confederalist perspective is anathemical to a long-term goal of locally based empowerment. But the Trump administration has been so awful in their relationships, particularly with Erdogan, with the Saudi prince, you know, that this has created a situation where any alternative is an improvement to the status quo, because the very space necessary to organize. I mean, can we imagine in 2016 if Hillary Clinton, despite all of her shortcomings, had been in power? I don't be looking at the situation in Serikania, at the situation in Girespi. You know, this would be very, very, very different, you know, than what we're facing today. So I think that, I mean, something in the track record of Obama-Biden, again, their willingness to cut with the you know, pre-ISIS forces, with forces linked to Al-Qaeda, while Turkey and Saudi Arabia remained with them. I think that's some indicator that perhaps Biden, the person, is willing to make a break with the past. Obviously, Biden's claim also to have a female on the ticket, I mean, that may or may not be significant in terms of a radical shift with the past, but it could have some significance. So, you know, their even limited measures are probably much an improvement versus status quo. But I agree with you, just to conclude, that unfortunately the Pandora's box has been opened, and, you know, ejecting these jihadist forces, many of whom have been recycled. If we look at the people who are responsible for Hevrin Khalaf's murder, you know, these are former ISIS fighters who were recycled in this force that is in alliance with Erdogan. So how are you going to push them out? You know, how are you going to prevent, you know, him Erdogan try to push millions of people into that zone, which is a traditionally Kurdish zone? So I think that these are all questions that need to be
Yeah, that's right. I think that's the critical question, is like, once the terrain on the ground has shifted, what does it mean to try to shift it back? Is it possible, or has the genie been let out of the bag, so to speak? But thank you for that. That's very, I think that's a very good question, a very informative set of comments.
So we've got Stephen going to ask a question, and then some questions that's come from Facebook that maybe Margaret can read out after that. So Stephen.
Thanks, Sarah. Jeff, thanks very much for your really informative talk. I just wanted you to bring back a wee bit to the discussion about delisting the PKK and how we might develop support for that demand. you said in your comments that PKK was not the whole Kurdish movement, which is true, but it's also important to remember that in Turkey, it's also not the whole focus of Erdogan's war, which is a war on democracy, it's a war on human rights, a war on peace itself, and all opposition in Turkey is labelled as being terrorists. Whether it be the HDP, the political field, the women's movement, human rights defenders. As you know, I'm a trade union activist. I was in Turkey earlier this year attending the trial of the leadership of KESK, the trade union, and the women's committee of KESK, and all of whom have now been charged with being members of the PKK, not for taking part in PKK activities, but for doing trade union activities, organising demonstrations, talking about austerity and cuts and stuff like that. That's enough to get you branded as a terrorist. And then, of course, we've had the democratically elected mayors and MPs have all removed from position, and many of them jailed with the recent case of the folk group that was on hunger strike and jailed, and so on and so forth. So I think it's important in a Western European context to remind people of the PKK is not an entity itself. So when we talk about the deal list and the PKK, it's not an end in itself. We build support for it by explaining that the war on the PKK is one focus of a whole war against democracy, against peace, against justice, which also championed. And I think in terms of how we build support for that, we need to tirelessly work to highlight the oppression of all those other people who are in favour of democracy, in favour of peace and justice. So the trade unions, the women's movement. And I think we need to do a great deal more here to make solidarity with those movements, but at the same time make the link that these trade unionists are being accused of being supporters of PKK. What's that about? And that opens up the discussion within our movement, if you like, the left, as to why the PKK is central, and Öcalan himself is central to that whole struggle for democracy. And finally getting to a question, having made my point, how much do you think is there more that could be done in that respect? I know we've got a number of Kurdish solidarity type campaigns, our own in Scotland. We've got the Freedom for Öcalan campaign, obviously, but we need to do. Don't you think we need to do more to highlight the specific examples in Turkey of how democracy is being attacked and curtailed in the name of fighting against PKK?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key question, the key issue, which is something that I think is implicit and even in some respects explicit in your comment, is it's important to link the struggle for democracy generally in Turkey to the question of the criminalization of the PKK. That issues of freedom of speech, for example, are things that liberals in the universities care about and get a lot of press here in the Western countries. Certainly, people talking about it on the campuses about how Erdogan clamps down on academics, on journalists. But few people actually know that the things that the academics and journalists were saying when they got clamped down on, they were objecting to the war against the Kurds and the war against the PKK and the breakdown of the peace process. So the centrality of the struggle for Kurdish rights and Kurdish freedom to the broader struggle for democracy in Turkey cannot be stressed enough. And the historical context of the links between authoritarianism, militarism, and the human rights atrocities and violations against the Kurdish people and the criminalization of the Kurdish people, I think that link has to be made all the time. So that, and I think that that's a really important element of raising consciousness about the Kurdish question, is saying that it's not just about it is all fundamentally about the right to self-determination of the Kurdish people, but it is also about freedom in the in the country and in the region and the world more generally. And so where I think that it's also really important to link that the Kurdish movement is not just an example of an oppressed minority, but it's also a movement that is at the vanguard, so to speak, of the struggle for an alternative to this very collectively suicidal set of social and political and economic arrangements that are governing the world. So I also think it's important to highlight the model of democratic confederalism that the Kurdish movement has espoused. So we need to be doing both of those things, and linking as well as going back to so much of the discussion that you can't just talk about the situation in Turkey without discussing the shitstorm that is going on across the region, though the war that's been going on for so long. So we also have to talk about the urgent need for peace in the Middle East and what that requires, and how addressing that requires not criminalizing the PKK. The PKK is an actor, which is an important actor, which is linked to a freedom struggle and a freedom movement that is not going anywhere and needs to be dealt with politically, needs to be recognized as a legitimate political actor that represents a people with legitimate political aspirations, and cannot be treated as a terrorist organization that cannot be negotiated with. But needs to be, particularly given the hypocrisy of the fact that all the geopolitical actors need to have some sort of relationship with the Kurdish movement in the north of Syria, and it's going nowhere in Turkey either. So anyhow, so I don't know if that completely answers your question, but I think that I think it's important to link it to the struggle for democracy in Turkey, but also the whole question of freedom in the Middle East and more generally in the world.
And I think maybe that, you know, people are actually beginning to wake up more generally to question actually what is a terrorist, you know, how are states using this thing, that it is actually, it's a political tool for delegitimizing whole struggles that they don't like. And people can see it when it's, particularly when it's domestic terrorism or it's you know, climate activists or whatever. People can make those links as well. I think with the broader political ones will relate very much to the question that's come from Facebook. Margaret, do you want to read that out? You there, Margaret? Or do you want me to read it?
I'm here.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself. Yeah, this is a couple of questions from Irina Shevchenko, and she says, is there any possibility of a coalition against the Rojava project? We always talk about the Turkish state, but what about the will of the other countries in Kurdistan territory? And then she says, is it possible that there's a dialogue of terrorism against the Kurds, that there's also an international strategy of the Turkish state against democratic confederalism because it's such a threat, providing worldwide inspiration? You kind of touched on that earlier, Jeff, in your speech.
Yeah, well, I definitely think that the question of what the Assad regime, what the Assad regime's intent or plans for Rojava is an open question, what they can do. Similarly, with respect to the Russians and their relationship, evolving, sometimes conflictual, sometimes collaborative relationship with the Turks. Those are open questions. But I definitely think that it certainly is the case that in the Arab nationalism of the Assad regime, the Iranian nationalism in Iran, as well as the anti-Kurdish sentiment in Iraq as well. All of all across the region, there's a broad historically rooted set of prejudices that easily get mobilized against the Kurdish people, and can also very much in the context of the ongoing wars get mobilized along the lines that the Kurds are pawns of the imperial power, et cetera, et cetera. This kind of logic can get mobilized. So I do think that the questions of the other regimes in the region and the hostility of the other regimes in the region to the prospect of Kurdish self-determination is important. And I also even think that the whole question of within the Kurdish ethnicity, the complicity between Barzani and the Turkish regime, and the whole question of the onslaught against the PKK in the Kandil Mountains that's been going on is also another question, to what extent that there's inside of the Kurdish community, there also is plans cutting against or limited levels of toleration for the PKK's project, even though there is also counter trends and counter tendency of calls for a broader pan-Kurdish unity as well. So I think that they're certainly important questions that need to be taken into consideration. And I definitely think that the machinations of all of the imperial powers in the Middle East and the scramble for the terrain in Syria make it so that on the one hand you have both Russia and the United States willing and able to negotiate and collaborate with the Kurds, but on the other hand, obviously willing and able to negotiate and collaborate with Turkey. So how that plays itself out is remains to be seen. But given the geostrategic significance of Turkey for all of the major actors, in the longer run, betrayal of the Kurds is to be expected.
Thanks. And just the second part was about the threat, the Turkish state acting against the Kurds as an international strategy because it's such a threat and providing worldwide inspiration.
Well, I think that the sense of the threat that is posed by the Democratic and Federal Project, if you talk to people in the American military establishment, for example, they don't see democratic confederalism as something that is fundamentally threatening their interests in the broader Middle East. They think that it's possible to co-opt and contain whatever radical potential there is and kind of Barzanify the movement in the longer run. And in the shorter run, they are crucially believe, the people in the Central Command at least, and the effectiveness of the Kurdish military force. That the fact that what they came up against, when ISIS came up against them, they came up against people who had courage of convictions, kind of revolutionary discipline, which was something that proved on the battleground, made them very effective. And so I think everyone sees them in the first and foremost in that respect as a very effective military force. I think principally for the Turkish state is the Kurdish project seen as an existential threat. And that has to do with the integral Turkish nationalism I talked about, but also for Arab nationalisms, it's seen to be a threat. Also for kind of Iranian nationalism, it can be seen as a threat, but it's ultimately seen as interpreted as a threat in national terms. Now, if democratic confederalism were to spread, if that kind of democratic and federal project were to spread across Turkey, across the Arab world, into Iran, then all of a sudden, with what that means for self-determination of the region, then I think you would see a very different kind of perception with respect to the threat of the Kurdish cause. But right now, I don't think that the major imperial actors interpret democratic confederalism as a fundamental threat to their interests in the region.
Thank you. I don't think so. I don't think we've got any more questions from anybody else. So I think I'm going to squeeze in another one. I want to go back to the peace process. And do you think, I mean, we've talked about why it didn't work, but do you think that it ever seriously was intended to work? Why did Turkey engage in it in the first place? And did they ever seriously intend to make peace?
I mean, I think we have to, when we think about the nation state, there are multiple projects that are at play and vying for power within the nation state. There is a deep state as well, which has more continuity. And actors, there's serious reason to believe that the deep state in Turkey has a set of objectives that are difficult to move. But it was, you know, within the realm of possibility. It seemed plausible. It certainly seemed plausible enough to Öcalan, to the Kurdish movement, to be engaged in some form of negotiations at the time. And it could very well, and right now, given the terrain and the way in which Erdogan is in bed with the far right and the deep state in Turkey, it seems, again, impossible. But I think that precisely to link it back to the question of the struggle for democratization in Turkey, if there's going to be a democratic opening in Turkey, this question is going to have to be on the table. So if you think that democracy is impossible in Turkey, then maybe peace is impossible in Turkey. But if you think that democracy is possible in Turkey, then peace has to be part of that, is what I would say. I do think that but again, we're in a moment of escalating anarchy in the bad sense, of chaos. Let's call it chaos, a spiraling of chaos and tyranny, not anarchy in the good sense of radical democracy or rule, that has led to massive bloodshed, and we're seeing surging fascisms, neo-fascism, certainly in the region and around the world, in the United States inclusively, and this then being linked to the capitalist crisis, the ecological catastrophe that's unfolding, and we definitely seem to be moving in direction of more and more bloodshed, more and more conflict, geopolitical rivalry, a reignition of arms races, etc. We seem to be moving in a bloodier and more authoritarian direction right now, certainly in the region and around the globe. But if we're going to survive as humanity, we need to have some kind of prospect for a peace process, and that's why Öcalan continues to call for a restart of the peace negotiations.
I think if we've not got anything more, we'll ask you to round up. I don't know if you want to. Oh, I'm getting another message. What's this one? Oh, sorry. Azad, do you want to come in again on the peace process rather than just send me a message quietly?
Yeah, Paul also was sending a message. I think he's got something to say too on this.
Azad, do you want to?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
As I studied this part of my project previously, I understand that the peace process was not named peace process by the Turkish authorities. It was called like this by the media. The Turkish authorities was using, they were using different names, especially reconciliation process, and even they used ending terrorism process.
Yeah.
For me, there was no peace process. No, it was used actually to fulfill some agendas of Erdogan and his AKP for grabbing power by limiting the role of military, Kemalist military generals, and by grabbing or by using it for election agendas and their ambition to change the Turkish system from parliamentarian to presidential. So the peace process was used, or what we call it peace process. Actually, there were memorandum and there was also peace process in Oslo. Before that, we call it peace process, but the Turkish authorities are not calling it peace process because they are not admitting there is a Kurdish question, a question of nation. They think it, or they construct it as terrorism problem and underdevelopment problem. Underdevelopment problem resulted or as a result from or exacerbated by terrorism, by the PKK terrorism. So this is a problem. It's not, media is exaggerating everything as making it as according peace process. Is not peace process for me is something different. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's reasons, particularly in hindsight, to believe that the question, the integrity of the Turkish state's will involved in the situation. But from the standpoint of the Kurdish movement wants peace. And in order to have peace, you need to have a certain kind of recognition, but there has to be some sort of opening up of politics. And certainly like in the Narrow's declaration of Öcalan and things like this, talking about the new era opening up, there seemed to be at the time some sort of belief that there was a genuine possibility. And post facto, it can look like that was always an illusion. But I think that Öcalan's inclination is to pressure for a democratic resolution at any moment, and to always be looking for how opportunities for a reignition of a kind of democratic resolution. And that democratic resolution requires an overriding kind of thoroughgoing democratization of relations in the country, in the region, and around the globe ultimately. So I think that it may well be in some respects utopian to aspire for peace, but it does seem to be that it's the only chance for humanity that we somehow open up a terrain of politics and an end to the warmongering that's going on in the region. And so that, I think, is why ultimately Öcalan remains very consistently advocate for some kind of peace process to commence, to recommence, to recommence, and to recommence.
I agree with you. I agree that the Kurds, the PKK leadership, and the Kurdish national movement as a whole, this is an ambition for the Kurds to have peace, and they have struggled quite much for this. But for me, it's essential a third party to be attended, and this kind of I mean, as somebody who is observing the situation, the conflict and the violations, that this kind of process could be called a peace process if there is an international guarantor or a kind of international representation, and also it should be preceded by delisting the PKK. Otherwise, it would be very, very tough process, and it would end as it ended in 2015. It ended very easily by a decision of Erdogan of returning to the military option and destroying the Kurdish community. And you saw all the results.
Yeah, I mean, and this is what Essa Musa, who headed the Imrali delegation, always said in respect to the analogy with the African National Congress, is that Mandela always said, to have peace negotiations, well, you have to be free. You can't have negotiations from a standpoint of freedom. So this is why the diasporic movement, the Kurdish movement more generally, mobilizes for freedom for Öcalan, delist the PKK as part and parcel of what it means to restart the peace process. But as you see with Öcalan himself, Öcalan is willing to negotiate even from a condition, even from a space of unfreedom. He seems to be always open for a recommencement of the dialogue.
I'm going to just let Paul come back in again, and then if you
Yeah.
want to do some final words.
Yeah, no, yeah. He had
Yeah.
some important questions that he was asking.
At least I'm going to, yeah. I think you can unmute yourself, Paul.
Okay, thank you. Just very briefly, I know that we're ending up. So if you could just give a little more information on these Turkish deep state actors. Are we talking about the Grey Wolves, MHP? Are we talking about Ergenekon, Veli Küçük, people like this? Who else is part of that web of death, that is really hitting hard, not only in Bakur, but in Rojava as well? And the second follow-up was just about, you mentioned the Iranian nationalism, but perhaps you could also talk a little about the whole theocracy, which is, which is basically almost as patriarchal as ISIS, and very, very anti-genealogy, anti-women's emancipation.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the question of the deep state in Turkey, you have to think about that historically with respect to the way in which the security apparatus and the state was involved in the violent extirpation of all kinds of opposition, radical opposition. And so you have all these really nasty links between kind of the security apparatus and the state and kind of broader fascist paramilitary organizations, which have been mobilized on multiple occasions and seem to, it becomes difficult to track entirely. But it also it's very much linked up into the broader national security apparatus of the state. So there's a sort of kind of the state apparatus and the fundamental militarism of the state and the way in which the state has been for decades weaponized originally in the context of the frontier of the Cold War and continues to be. So those elements which were linked into, for example, the discussion we were having earlier with respect to the national security meetings that took place around Kobane as well, where people were saying, no, the only way to deal with the Kurdish movement generally is to follow the Sri Lanka model. Those are people, like, let's say, within the deep state that never wanted peace, don't want peace, see peace to be exactly the opposite of what is in the interest of the Turkish nation state. So I think that there's you have to, in order to kind of reveal the workings of the deep state, you have to think about it in that historical context and the way in which the security apparatus of the state has been mobilized for decades against all kinds of radical politics in the region, and continues to be, and is now in all kinds of murky relations with, as you said, the jihadist forces in the region. With respect to the question of the situation in Iran, certainly I did an interview with an activist, an academic on this question of the increasing repression against the Kurdish movement in Iran in the context of the unfolding COVID crisis. And certainly the regime is a brutal, tyrannical regime as well. So that does not see eye to eye, to the contrary, with the Kurdish movement. So the struggle for Kurdish freedom is at odds with tyranny and patriarchy everywhere in the region. So yeah.
Do you want any more general final words, Jeff?
No, I think it's a really good conversation. Obviously, as you see, like, it makes me feel like I shouldn't have talked for so long at the outset, since there's so many people that know at least as much as I do. So proving your point, Sarah, that this has to be that even if I'm qualified to speak, I've proven my point against you that I'm not necessarily the most qualified person to speak. But that again, I think is the reason why we should be believers in the democratic and federal principles. That together we can come to a kind of collective understanding that supersedes our individual understanding. So I think so thank you guys for the good questions and the good conversation.
And thank you both for your speech and for prompting a really interesting discussion. So thanks very much. And thanks everybody for being here today.
All right, thank you.